Hi, good afternoon. Well, hello everyone, and welcome to the Nasher. I'm Curator of Education, Anna Smith, and today it is my pleasure to introduce artist Will Boone in conversation with Lucia Simek. Houston native Will Boone makes paintings, sculptures, films, and installations whose graphic power is matched by their palpable physicality, and at times he unpacks the loaded iconography of Texas pop culture. His 2019 exhibition, Highway Hex, at the Contemporary Arts Museum Houston connected Texas with California by way of Leatherface, who is arguably one of our state's less divisive public figures. And his broader body of work weaves together movies, music, industrial manufacturing, conspiracy theories, and more with a lo-fi punk sensibility. Boone has been the subject of solo exhibitions at Karma, New York in 2017, the Rubel Family Collection Miami in 2014, and a major installation was featured in Desert X 2017 in Coachella Valley, California. Other group shows include the delightfully named Zombies, Pay Attention at Aspen Art Museum in 2019, White Trash at Luring Augustine Bushwick in 2017, Prototopology at Gagosian Gallery Rome in 2016, Fétiche at Venus over Manhattan in 2016, In Different Ways at Almine Rec London in 2016, and Love for Three Oranges at Gladstone Gallery Brussels in 2015. Public collections include the Institute of Contemporary Art Miami, Rubel Family Collection, and Fundación Baruch Spinoza Lisbon, Portugal, among others. Joining Boone in conversation is artist, writer, and curator Lucia Simek. Since 2014, Simek has served as the Nasher's Senior Manager of Communications and International Programs, where she organizes the Nasher Prize Dialogue Series and serves as editor-in-chief of the Nasher magazine. She also organizes a highly acclaimed series of public talks with artists and writers for the historic Adolphus Hotel, and is currently working on a book about the complicated relationship to Texas shared by mid-century artists Forrest Bess, Alberto Berry, and Myron Stout. In September, Simek will begin a new role as Director of External Affairs at the Dallas Contemporary. I know we're in for a conversation full of unexpected delights today, so please join me now in welcoming Will Boone and Lucia Simek.
All right. Hi, everybody. It's funny to be up here on the stage. I've been behind the scenes here at the Nasher for 8 years, so it's funny to be actually looked at here. Thanks, Anna, for introducing us. So I'm very excited to be in conversation with my friend, Will Boone. We spent the better part of the last year preparing for this talk, but also pretty much geeking out over affinities for similar things. So a love of Texas lore and history, but also its fictions, and considerations of landscape and all of that. So it's been really fun to work together to put this together. When I first began conversations with Will back in 2020, before the pandemic and before everything shut down, he was living out in LA with his wife, Stephanie, having defected from Houston some years before, making their way through New York. But then when the pandemic hit, they decided to come back to Texas, first to the Hill Country, where they had a house on a cliff. And then they decided, once they were about to have a baby, that maybe it would be better to move somewhere where the baby could learn to walk and not fall off the cliff. So they moved back, and for other reasons, but moved back to Houston. So they sort of mapped this full circle of a journey. The more I came to know Will's work in the last year, his varied and very intense interest in Texan subcultural icons and legends, crimes and criminals, its political malfeasance, antics, heroes, its complex but often very boring landscape. The more I started to think of Will with his long journey back to the place he started as a kind of punk rock cowboy Odysseus. Like he's an updated Augustus McCrae from Larry McMurtry's Lonesome Dove, who decides to leave Texas, go follow the cattle drives up to Montana, gets to Montana, proceeds to be fatally wounded, and then decides that he'd like his best friend to haul his body back to Texas because he thinks that's where he has to be. So Will's a little like that. And on a larger scale, I think Will's sculptural practice is always teasing at this notion of return, how history repeats itself, or how some human tendencies remain constant over time, like our need to monumentalize our glories or revise our failures and misdeeds. In her recent translation of Homer's Odyssey, Emily Wilson says of the poem that it promotes but also questions its own fantasies and ideals, such as the idea that time and change can be undone, and the notion that there is such a place as home. So these ideas are very much at the heart of Will's work. With all that in mind, I asked Will to gather images and some thoughts in sort of like a classical, epic, mythological format where he has his origin story, his journey, his homecoming, and then the sort of legacy he's created and sort of what that homecoming portends for the future of his work. So why don't we start? He has a lot of images here, and I will say we culled it down from many, many more.
Yeah, Lucia said she wanted an image-heavy talk.
Yeah, you really.
And I emailed her 500 images for the hour.
Yeah, it would have been kind of like driving really fast maybe if we had done that. So why don't we start here, Will, in this scene, but I want you to start sort of by describing your origin stories here in Texas, and we can move through these, but just sort of where you began and how you worked your way to even being an artist at all.
So I grew up in Houston, and I traveled often to South Texas, to LaSalle County, where my family had been for, it's debatable, maybe 7 generations-ish. And I feel like I had kind of a normal Texas upbringing, hunting and fishing. And there was always this dichotomy between spending time in Houston in this extremely urban situation and then spending time in the country, and going out with my dad, hunting, turkey hunting. And I did that until I heard Nirvana, the band. And I think that it's really a big part of being an artist is identifying these heroes. And Kurt Cobain was probably my first artistic hero. And I was aware of this sort of the breadth of what he was interested in. And that part of being an artist is being a fan and a collector, and so that was a big thing. And realizing that he was influenced by bands that were close to him in sound, but also people like Leadbelly, who was a blues musician that was in Texas and Louisiana, and that was sort of this revelation where to think about this guy who's this punk singer from Seattle being influenced by this guy from the early 20th century that traveled around playing a guitar and was in and out of prison. And that was sort of this example where you can be influenced by anything. And it's almost more interesting to look outwards beyond the things that are close to you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so around middle school, I picked up a guitar and started playing with my friends. And, we had bands and we'd play shows, but we were never really allowed to play in clubs or anything like that. So I had to play at people's houses or play in sort of these alternative spaces, warehouses that were squats or whatever. And it was kind of you learn that as much as you can be inspired by something, there's also this source of making your work by pushing against things. Mm-hmm. And pushing against boundaries. And so rather than always, seeing something beautiful or seeing something special and wanting to make work about that, I found myself kind of like being repelled by things and finding, as an artist, like you're always moving, you're always trying to figure out a way to move forward, move your work forward, move your ideas forward. And that's not always like, comes from like a positive place maybe.
Yeah, that forward doesn't necessarily mean positive. Yeah, or something that is, rooted to good things. Yeah.
So we were like playing in bands, and me and a bunch of my friends, we worked at this ice cream store, and this guy would come into the ice cream store, and it was sort of like a permissive ice cream shop. Like they let us do kind of a lot of stuff there. And one thing that we did was we would like make drawings and make weird paintings and put them up on the walls. And this guy would come in and get ice cream, and he'd be like, well, who made this fucking painting, And he'd be like, oh, well, that guy did, And then like a week or two later, he came in and he had this huge roll of canvas, like a 6-foot roll of unprimed, unstretched canvas. And he came in with it and like plopped it down in front of the counter and was like, all right, now you guys can make a whole bunch of paintings, And so we took the canvas and we cut it all up, and we were like, we all made all this work, and we were like, we didn't know who this guy was, and we were like, he's probably rich. So we're gonna have an art show, and we'll have him come to the art show, and maybe he'll buy our paintings. And so he came, we did an art show. It was like at this warehouse, and like there was a fight, and the cops came, made everyone leave, and all this stuff like that. And then, but the guy came and he bought this painting from me, and then he called me, I don't know, a few weeks later and said, yeah, well, I want you to like come and bring the painting over to my studio. I want you to install it in my studio so that like I can show it to people. And I said, your studio, what do you mean? He's like, well, I'm an artist. I want you to put it in my art studio. And it was this guy, Mark Flood. And so I went over to his studio, and it was like this house that was like about to fall over. And it was like, I went to go hang my painting, I hung my painting, and I ended up sitting there for, I don't know, like 4 or 5 hours and just listening to him talk. And it was like meeting this person who was not only like one of the first artists I'd meet, but like someone who's completely obsessed with art. And not just their own art, like everyone else's art, the artworks from ancient civilizations, just like obsessed with art. And being like, it was almost like meeting this sort of like outlaw figure, this like Dickensian person who's like, this is the way it is, and like all the stuff you think in the world, that's their world, and we're artists and we have our own world. And so like Mark's work was really influential, and we hung out, I don't know, 5 or 6 years. In the back upstairs of his house, there's like this room. He was like, there used to be a raccoon up there. And so I never put anything in there, and I don't think the raccoon's there anymore. And you can have it, you can work up there. And I have a bad back, and so when I need you to like move a painting, I'll just yell, and you come down and like move my painting for me, and then just go back upstairs. And so we had this like weird deal. And at 4 o'clock we'd meet. There was one room that was like clean, that had a TV, and we'd meet in that room at 4 o'clock, and we'd watch the show Fear Factor. And it's like, I don't know if you know about it. It's like where people eat bugs or they like jump off of buildings for money. So that was like my art practice, developing budding art practice in Houston. But at the same time, Mark had like worked at the Manil really early on. He like wandered in, and they didn't have guards. And he said, can I be a guard? And they were like, well, yeah, but you can only work like 2 days a week because you'll get too bored, And so, and then Walter Hopps was the director there at the time, so he met Walter and this whole thing. So I was sitting there talking to Mark, explaining to me all the stuff that Walter had explained to him, and it was just sort of interesting alternative education. And so that's a picture of me in Mark's studio back then. I don't even know what year, that was probably like 2004 or something like that. And so Mark's work, he was sort of this local legend. And he made these paintings called imperatives, where he'd paint these sort of commands on the paintings. And so, like also sort of as artists being underground, he made this painting that said, eat human flesh. And there was this house that was sort of like, he said it was kind of this druggy house where the bass player, he was in a band, and the bass player from his band lived there. And so he gave this painting to the bass player. And I guess that it was around the time where there was this tourist who got murdered in Mexico, in Matamoros, by like a cult or something, like a satanic cult. And so there was sort of this sensationalized, I think they call it like the satanic panic.
Yeah.
And so somehow Houston police had been sort of surveilling this house where the Eat Human Flesh painting was like hanging in the living room. And I guess they raided it in this drug bust, and they find these kids hanging out in there with this painting that says Eat Human Flesh. And they're like, we've found a cannibal cult here in the heart of Montrose in Houston, Texas. And so all the news crews went over there, and like Mark said he was watching the news, and it was like, holy shit, there's my painting, you know? And you can see it, yeah. And then that's the cop, you know, you see it kind of on the wall there.
Yeah.
And then the cops, so they're interrogating all the kids, and they're like, well, what, you think this painting is funny, you know? And the reporters are asking him questions on the news. And so Mark's like, this is my chance, you know? And so he put on his jacket and he went over there to get on the news, you know? And he thought this will be his big break. He made it onto the news. And the unfortunate thing that happened was the police confiscated the painting and he never got it back. And so it was sort of like this, I don't know.
Yeah, he was like,
Mark.
I thought it was this moment where he would like capitalize off of the bad attention around these paintings, and then he started to make more of them, didn't he?
Yeah, I think he made 5 more, and then he tried to have a show that was just those paintings, and like a bunch of people came that had seen him on the news, but no one bought the paintings. They're kind of like, what is?
Yeah. So Mark was like this person that never left Houston. He's a very well-known artist that's like done a ton of stuff, has, you know, is internationally known character, but he never left Houston, and he has friends everywhere, but he's committed to being there. But he encouraged you to think about leaving, or there's some sense that he thought you should go, or was he important in that shift in your life?
Yeah, no, I mean, he would jokingly be like, you don't want to end up like me, you know, sitting on this couch or whatever, you know, so. And yeah, when we left, my wife and I, when we left Houston and went to the East Coast, it was sort of like, I think I sold Mark. He bought a bunch of drawings so that I could like rent the U-Haul to drive to the East Coast.
Yeah. So Rauschenberg, this is a important person in your
right. That's like the second Kurt Cobain was Rauschenberg. Finding out, you know, and he's like I found like he was like a really permissive figure, you know, and it was like, and I don't know if I saw this piece in particular. I have this memory of seeing this piece as a little boy and just being like ecstatic, and seeing it in a museum and feeling like, if this guy can put this nasty old goat in this museum and people are paying to come in and look at it, you can do whatever you want, you know? And then I found out Rauschenberg was like from right down the road in Port Arthur, and that was really inspiring as well. And
Go ahead.
yeah, and just the more that I learned about him, the more that he kind of became this huge hero for me. And even at an early point, maybe sometime in high school.
Yeah. Yeah, one of the things you and I read in this last year, well, parts of it anyway, was Calvin Tompkins' art off the wall about Rauschenberg, and like all these different stories about him as he was sort of ascending in the art world. But but I love this one, and I love that you care about it so much, because the story of it, well, we'll get to it. The full relationship will reveal itself in your later work, but like the tenderness toward ugly things, you know, in this particular, like when Rauschenberg bought this goat, which he had to really like argue to buy from a furniture store in New York City, where it was just like a decorative thing, like I guess like a real hook, like what's that goat, and then people would come in, but he washed it with dog shampoo like 3 or 4 times once he brought it into his house. And then half the face was smashed in, and so he said, you know, that poor goat. So he like tenderly painted over the face. And like all of these acts of tenderness, which then later look like some kind of defacement or something. And so that relationship between tenderness and a kind of rebellion against the object or something. But I just think there's such a lovely connection with your work there.
Yeah, there's also the other funny part is like, I think he bought it, he negotiated $30.
Yeah.
Was going to be the price for the goat.
Yeah.
The guy was like, I won't sell it. Okay, $30, you know?
Mm-hmm.
But he was actually so broke that all he had was $15, and he was like, I'm going to get the other $15, and I'll come back and pay you. And the guy was like, okay, you can take the goat now. And he said he I don't know, months later or something had $15, so he went back, and the store had gone out of business, and it was closed.
He never.
Just like, yes. Yeah.
Yes, score.
And there's this other book that we read. I read it a couple of years ago, and I've kind of gone back to it. And it's written by a guy named Lawrence Wright, who's from Texas. It's called God Save Texas. And he kind of has this idea about, I think it's applicable to it's not exclusively Texas, but this idea that there's 3 levels of culture, there's this thing that you're kind of steeped in, being from Texas, there's stuff that you're just exposed to that kind of gets in there, and then if you leave, you go out in the world and you travel and you see these other things and they influence you. And then, if you're able to return to where you're from, there's this way to sort of take those 2 things and put them together and make this hybrid that's this higher form of what you're doing. Mm-hmm. And I think it's something that Rauschenberg did. He mentions Rauschenberg as an example in the book, especially with the series Gluts, which are my favorite of his works. And that's where he came back to Texas in the 80s during the oil crisis and made all these pieces out of signs, that had to do with cars and gas and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and then there's this really wild show that happened at the Modern in Fort Worth before it was called that and before it was in the building it's in. But this is a crazy story I did not know about until you told me about this series.
So I think it was 76, and it was the 200th anniversary of the Fort Worth rodeo. And so they decided to have this show where what they do is the year before during the rodeo, they invited a group of artists to come and hang out for 2 weeks at the rodeo and go behind the scenes and stuff. And then they had a year to create these pieces in response to that. And then the next year, on the 200th anniversary, they would have this art show. And I think where this indoor rodeo is right by the museum, so it was sort of connected.
Yeah.
And so Rauschenberg made this piece. I think they commissioned 2 pieces. One of them was called Rodeo Palace, and so they. Rauschenberg was in the
Was Whistle Stop one of them?
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's the one the Modern has. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it was actually it was kind of at the same time, but it may not have been in the show.
Okay.
But so Rauschenberg was in the show. There's an artist who is another hero of mine named Terry Allen that was in the show. And so they came back, and it was sort of this, I think it was the first work of his. It was in an institution in Texas. And so they really tried to have this homecoming kind of party thing. And so they're so grateful for the piece that, and Rauschenberg came, and then they went out to this ranch, outside of Fort Worth, outside of Dallas, to have this party, And so they're dancing, they set up this whole thing, these tents, and they have a band playing, and they said Rauschenberg was dancing with his sister, and they were doing this dance where they're two-stepping or something, and his sister had her thumbs in his belt loops, and so they're going all around, and he was, I guess, a great dancer. Mm-hmm. And then all of a sudden, there's a helicopter comes, and these guys go out in the field with flashlights, and they're waving around the lights, and the helicopter lands, and then the mayor of Fort Worth gets out of the helicopter and comes and gives Rauschenberg the key to the city, and it's on this rope thing, this ribbon, and so he puts it on, and then it's the party goes on and on, everyone's drinking and having a great time, and so then everyone gets back on these buses to come back to Fort Worth. And they stop in Granbury at like a little store, so people could like get out, smoke a cigarette, buy a Coca-Cola or whatever, right? So Rauschenberg goes to use the restroom, and there's like a really long line, like everyone's waiting to use the restroom. So he's like, oh, whatever. So he goes out on the other side of the bus, and he starts urinating on the tire. And then this like car full of, there's multiple accounts, either Texas Rangers, state troopers, or police, Granbury police officers come. They light him up. They arrest him in front of everyone, put him in the cop car, and take him to the jail. And so it's like this woman who is the curator, she's like, oh, I got to figure out what to do. So she calls the house where they had the party. And that guy, had some pull. And so he thinks it's hilarious. So he gets in his car and he drives down there and he kind of like explains to the cops, like, look, this is the situation. And he makes them think it's kind of funny. Meanwhile, they're like checking, they're booking Rauschenberg at the police station. And they said like, they're like, empty your pockets. And so he starts like emptying his pockets, and it's like seashells and feathers and like all this weird shit that he would pick up constantly for use in his art. And they're just kind of bugging out. And then he has the key to the city around us. And they're like, well, what's that? And he's like, it's the key to Fort Worth. And they're like, well, give us the key. And he's like, well, what? Will it open up the jail cell too, And so then they negotiate to get him out of the jail. But it's also this funny thing that I feel like where it's kind of the nature of Texas, where it's like, on one hand, you have these people that are like, we're going to throw you this awesome party. On the other hand, like, don't get caught peeing on a tire.
Yeah.
Fucked,
Yeah. It's going to be a wild night. But then on the other hand, if you're funny enough, you might get out of jail.
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you want to talk about these Terry Allen pieces? Because your work is so in the vein of these.
Yeah. And so then Terry was another artist. He was younger, and he's from Lubbock. And he's a musician as well. And this was his first sort of installation piece. And something interesting he said about this rodeo show was that they had artists from like outside of Texas be a part of it, and all those artists' work was like cowboy hats and like horses and kind of like this really kind of surface stuff. But then he said like Rauschenberg and some of the other artists who are like from Texas that had been around a rodeo, they kind of looked more inward and made these conceptual pieces. And so Terry was young, and he had like, I think he had a show the year before at the Cam in Houston. And he was working on these works on paper and these drawings and stuff that related to his music. And this is one of them. So he had like drawn this bed that had like a grave dug in it. And so when they offered him the opportunity to have this show, it sort of had a larger budget, larger scope, he said he had always wanted to make this thing, in real life. So he built this installation that was like about the three places where rodeo cowboys spend their time. And it's like bar rooms, motel rooms, and like the arena. And sort of it was this hybrid of all three. And part of it was, he said there was a TV, there was like a motel kind of armoire kind of thing, and there's a TV on top, and he made a movie of his wife, and he was like, Joe Harvey, she had a big bouffant hairdo, and she was in the mirror putting on lipstick, and we got this big Palomino stallion, and we brought it into the motel room. So she's putting on her lipstick, and it's just eating her beehive. And I was like, can I see this anywhere? He's like, no, And I was like, did they let you just do this? And he's like, well, these guys from Oklahoma had these motel rooms, and we made up these badges that said film crew. And everyone was so excited because they thought we were making a movie that they let us do whatever we want. And he said they got to the point where they were like, well, what about the horse? Can we bring the horse in the motel room? Can we take the bed out so we can bring this horse in? And so his wife went and asked the manager, and he said, like, lady, that horse is probably a lot cleaner than most of the people that stay in this motel. And this is another sort of Texas hero, Dave Hickey. And this is a photo that Terry Allen took of Dave Hickey at the Willie Nelson picnic, which Dave was selected to kind of curate. I think they had like, the big guys, Willie and his friends playing, and then Dave picked these sort of lesser known songwriters that he thought were more interesting to play kind of in these odd slots. So Terry was one of them, Billy Joe Shaver, I think a guy, Lee Clayton. There are several. Terry said he got the check bounced from Willie Nelson. He said he has this check stamped with insufficient funds. But I think it was this sort of interesting time in the Willie Nelson picnic. So my parents went, and they're always talking about it. It's like this thing that they did, and it was sort of, Texas is like often about two things colliding and then kind of being like, we're okay with colliding, I guess, and we'll become one thing. And Willie Nelson's picnic, it seems like it's sort of like the first time there was like the rednecks and the hippies.
Yeah, and the kittens.
Got along, and the and the bikers with the kittens.
So good.
And so Dave was, he had a gallery in the 60s in Austin and was always a champion of Texas artists, like Rauschenberg, Terry Allen, other artists.
Roche.
Yeah.
Roche. That's
Jim
the one.
Roche, yeah. There's an artist from Dallas. He made these works, these ceramic works called Potted Mamas. This is a Dave Hickey's gallery photo of the inside of it. He was like 26 years old. I always think about him as being this like permanent old man.
Yeah, right.
But at one point he was 26 years old.
Yeah, he was. Yeah. He defected from literature to do this gallery, a clean, well-lighted space.
Yeah.
And the rest is history with him. So this slide sort of marks your shift in out of your inspiration Texas moments and into Will Boone leaving Texas, and then you get to your work, which is the first we've seen. We're gonna have to pick up our pace a tiny bit, just so you know.
What time are we at?
We got like 20 minutes or so.
Left?
Yeah.
Oh, wow. So this is a sculpture I made in New York. I found this weird place in the subway where it's like the police. The subway, there's all these doors, and sometimes you can open a door and then there's like a hallway. So we were kind of exploring these subways, and we found this place where these police had been hanging out. And there was some lockers and a file cabinet, and I got the file cabinet. The interesting thing was it was decorated with these stickers. It reminded me of like high school. Mm-hmm.
You got the filing cabinet.
Got the filing cabinet, yeah. I turned it into the piece of furniture.
Yeah.
And then after that, I made several more pieces with file cabinets. There was a show that they wanted to make this show about a cowboy at this gallery in New York. And it was a similar thing where it's like, maybe you could do something, about a cowboy. And I was more thinking about this, like, the fantasy of being a cowboy. And like there's not that many cowboys. There's a lot of people who want to be cowboys. And these like weird things that people make to pretend like they're riding bulls. So I found a bunch of images of things like this, these barrels that these guys would make and suspend with like chains or springs or whatever.
So you're in New York at this point, and how do people know, like, the guy to do the cowboy thing is Will Boone? Like, how is this something that became known about you?
I don't know. People figured out I was from Texas.
Yeah.
Which initially I tried to disguise, but then it was sort of like, you're a Texan. It was like, well, okay, maybe I am a Texan.
It's hard to hide.
And so then it was interesting because I discovered, I had a show. This is one of my first shows at Karma in New York. And it was sort of recreating this apartment in Houston where I had spent a whole bunch of time. So in Houston, when there's a hurricane, people put tape on the windows because they think it's going to keep the window from breaking or something. And then they don't ever take the tape off. So you'll see these apartment buildings that just have these sort of X's with duct tape. So I just kind of took some of these things and like formalized them and made sculptures and paintings out of them. and working with what I had at that time.
The story of the basketball playing card, I really love.
Oh yeah, I had this when I left Houston. My friend gave me this basketball card. You know, it's like a baseball card for a basketball player of Vernon Maxwell, who was sort of like the bad boy of the Houston Rockets. And I carried around in my wallet, and I kind of felt like a Catholic, like carrying like an image of his saint or something. And the thing just got so blown out and sweated and, you know, like gross, that eventually it was dying, and I photocopied it. And then I liked the photocopy so much, I blew it up and then sort of made a painting out of it.
So yeah, this whole show is like, you get to New York, you're there, you're being an artist, and you get your first like New York show at a really good gallery, and you do a show about Texas.
Yeah, I guess it's just where my mind was.
Yeah.
You know, I was like lonesome for this place.
Yeah.
And at that point, I felt like I would go back to Texas once a year whenever I could afford to, and it felt like returning to sort of like a well or something. Like I knew there was a place that inspired me so much, and it would like, I would get as much of it as I could, and then go back and try to like sustain that energy.
Yeah, right, once you were gone.
Eventually led to me questioning like, well, what if I just like went back? What if I stayed at the well?
Yeah,
You know?
what would happen then?
Yeah.
Yeah, so Katie Nolan, these were important for you in terms of the sort of outsider perspective on Texas.
Yeah, Katie Nolan was like an artist. Maybe I found out about her before I had that show, but I felt like I loved her work. I was just like, what is this? What is this, you know? And I felt like I recognized the images in it. I felt a closeness to these clippings that she selected. And then I started to read her writings, and it was just like so negative. And judgmental, and you know, there's like a part where she says like, well, Texas, she has this great essay, it's called, I think, Towards a Meta Language of Evil. And in part of it, she's talking about Texas, and she said like the word Texas is shorthand for the assassination of JFK. And Texas implies violence, and Texas is this, and Texas is that. And I think maybe, I haven't really thought about that much till now, but I think that maybe at that point it was like, well, really is it? And like maybe, what do I think about? What is Texas to me? And like maybe I know what Texas is because I'm from there. And you're from New York or whatever, you know?
Yeah. You have a kind of defense that goes up about
Yeah.
that. Yeah. Like, you can't talk about that.
But at the same time, loving her work and becoming
Yeah.
completely obsessed with it.
Yeah. Yeah, but just this whole thing that, just highlighting the violence versus the more, sort of more nostalgic things that you were feeling about it at that time, which works its way in later. So here we go.
Then we moved to LA.
You moved to LA.
Thinking we get a little more space, have a yard, drive, have a parking lot to park in, you know, all those great things I missed. And I always like this image. I love Pettibone, and I always loved him from like the punk, being into punk and early on. And I felt like this was always in my head. I thought California would be different. Yeah. I love this piece.
Yeah.
I immediately sort of really started exploring the landscape of LA. I lived in a strange place, sort of on this hill that was like this derelict, like kind of ugly, yet undeveloped, like nature. So that's
With sort of like passages for like what suggests a kind of criminal activity of
yeah,
some kind.
yeah. There's always evidence
Yeah.
of things, evidence of people being in places.
Yeah, trespassing.
Yeah. And then you also in LA, I started to see like people just taking what they had and making stuff out of it everywhere, you know. And like there's all these, near where I lived in East LA, there are all these muffler shops, and the guys at the muffler shops would take these sort of parts and make these little figures. I think they're called like muffler men. This is a really great one. And then when Halloween started, we had this yard, so we started like making really crazy Halloween decorations, and it was. No one could get to our house because there was a dirt road and we were up on this hill, but we still would decorate our yard, Stephanie and I. And it was like, this is like art for us, you know what I mean? It wasn't, no one saw it except for us. And so building those and led to me kind of like thinking about these narratives, you know, and creating these narratives, like almost like instead of writing a story making a little maquette, and working with models and thinking about models as a way to like understand something. It's just like you can understand something if it's this big, even if it's a really big idea. So that started to be something I explored in the work. And I found these model pieces. They're like these plastic model kits you glue together. And so I started using parts of them in these little maquettes. And I was going to like flea markets to find the pieces. You could find these broken pieces and spare parts. You could find like Frankenstein's arm, and you could find, the Wolfman's head, or, Johnny Unitas throwing a football. And so I started collecting those, and at the same time...
And those model pieces, just maybe explain, because they're sort of antiquated at this point. Like, I don't know if people still, maybe people still do, but like they're very much like of a time or like a hobby thing
they're
for
hobby,
like grown men.
Yeah. They look like toys, but they're like really complicated to put together and glue. And it's like, men put them together. Yeah. Not kids.
And then they paint them too.
Yeah, they paint them.
Yeah.
And there's sort of like this impossible thing to paint because they're so small. So oftentimes you have this thing that someone like very tediously glued together and constructed, and then they go to paint it, and it's just like this smeary mess. And so, I made these models. This is one that was sort of like Dracula looking into a mirror. Dracula moved to LA. Dracula, he's sort of like Pinocchio. He like traded to his powers to become a man, and he ends up like working in one of those restaurants like Dan Tana's or like Musso and Frank's, where the waiters wear these monkey suits and he's got a fake tan. So he's looking in the mirror. So then around the same time I was collecting all these model pieces, I went to a show at the Getty of Hellenistic bronze statues. And I started to see that like a lot of the gestures and the figures were the same. And these themes were the same: athletes, monsters, politicians, heroes, and even the physical remains of the models, how I would find them. Because if you find them put together, they're really expensive, like hundreds of dollars, but you can find these broken pieces and buy a Ziploc bag of them for like $10 or whatever. So how the physical remains of the models, these pieces, they look just like how the bronzes were. And so I started kind of thinking like, well, thematically, like Frankenstein is like our Medusa, or JFK is our Julius Caesar, or whatever it is. And start thinking about like swapping the two. Like what would these things be like if they were made out of bronze, if they were at this like heroic scale? And I wanted to make them, but I also didn't want them to put them directly into a show, like in a gallery right away. So I made this like long list of places where I wanted to show them, and sort of like these fantasies. And one was in a bomb shelter. And I didn't know like really anything about bomb shelters. And so I was driving down the freeway and in Los Angeles, and I saw this huge banner, and it said survival. It was like an airplane hangar with like this like 100-foot banner. And me and my friend were like, let's check it out. So we got on the freeway and turned around and went in, and it was like this bomb shelter factory. And this guy was making these bomb shelters and selling them. And so it was like all these guys welding all these things together. In the back, there was like a little shop, like office. So I went and knocked on the door, and the guy was like, there were people like signing the paperwork, like buying one, and he was like, come back in 5 minutes or whatever. So I wander around, I go back. And I start talking to the guy, and I'm like, I want to like put this like sculpture inside. I was trying to be vague, and he was like, what do you mean? I was like, well, I want to put this statue of JFK inside of a bomb shelter. Like, do you think I could rent one from you? Because I had found these JFK models, and I started collecting them, multiples of them. So he was like, I don't know, And so I left, and I came back, But it was funny because he was like, well, what kind of statue? And I was like, okay, well, I want to put a statue of JFK. He was like, well, that's why you're here, huh? I was like, what do you mean? And he said, well, my design for my bomb shelter, I basically found the Army Corps of Engineers blueprints for this bomb shelter that JFK had on Peanut Island in Florida, and that's what I'm selling. So it's just like, whoa, I gotta figure out how to do this. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Gotta figure this out. Where's this gonna go? And so then they had this, I found out about this like biennial that they were doing for the first time outside LA in the desert. And so I started making like all these maquettes of this sculpture, you know, and obsessively. And I took everything else out of my studio but these maquettes and these models of the bomb shelter. I made all these different versions out of whatever I could find. Like this one's in like a fish tank. And then when someone would come visit my studio, I'd say, this is all I have. This is all that I'm working on or whatever. And so eventually we figured out a way to pay for it. We got the bomb shelter, we got out to the desert. We put it in the ground. And so it was like this hatch you would go down into. And the thing that was cool about it was that, you know, it like didn't have my name on it. And all these people, I went to the hardware store and this guy was like, what are you doing? You know, I was getting like I don't remember, I was getting something. We needed some bolts or something. I was like, well, we're like working up the road. He's like, oh, are you guys like putting that thing in the ground? I was like, how do you know? He's like, everybody knows, man. Like everybody's been driving by, like what the hell's going on over there? And so once it was in, it became this thing where there were like, all these people were going to see it. They had no idea that it was an art piece. They didn't know who I was. And it was this really beautiful thing to kind of lose ownership of a piece and just have it like exist, have it have nothing to do with me, no explanation. And so it was like this weird thing where people were just going down in there, climbing all over it, taking pictures. Teenagers going down there and smoking weed. It just became like this weird thing.
Yeah. And that it was like this American, you know, this like mythical American story and this character and everyone relating to it and bringing different things to it. Regular people, not art people.
Yeah.
Gathering all kinds of just like the populace to this thing that lost your identity, wasn't related to art to most people. Most like, oh, there's JFK. There's where he is.
Yeah.
He's been out here this whole time.
Yeah, I guess it was sort of thinking about this mythology, like almost like Elvis or something. Like he's like hidden away somewhere.
Yeah.
So then after that, I started exploring these sculptures, the same idea, just in different forms. This is like, you know, about this gesture, this arm reaching out. That was the maquette. That was a model version. This is a sculpture that I made out of bronze. This is another one. I can kind of go through these.
Okay.
I would see different things that would inspire me. I was like in Florida going for an airboat ride, and they had this crocodile kind of like cantilevered, and that was really exciting. So I made this shark kind of emulating the same thing.
Yeah. And referencing your cowboy barrel again too.
Yeah, it's like a livestock feeding trough that the shark is emerging out of.
Yeah.
I started looking at, this is a photo that I took, I think somewhere in Rome, or not in Rome, in Italy somewhere, and I started thinking about the drapery, the fabric, and how it was depicted in the sculptures, and found it in these capes. And I started thinking about if you broke the cape off the figure, it sort of is this symbol of power. You know, and the idea of the absence of a hero. So this is a series of sculptures. I made 3 of them. I found this painting I really liked, and there was this model of like a witch that I copied and built these. And I installed these on the back lot of Paramount Studios in LA. So it's like this street that, it looks like New York, but it's a set.
Yeah.
Similar thing, I started to think about these bases, you know, without the figure. And the Frankenstein was one model in particular that the base is really special. I made that. Made a bronze out of that, this grave.
Yeah, so good.
One thing a lot of them reminded me of, there are animals. They kind of reminded me of these mascots, these high school football mascots. One of my high schools, they had this fiberglass statue, and when the football team would score a touchdown, they would like, you know, lift it up and run back and forth up and down the field. And so, you know, and a lot of these things are like these archetypal sort of animals, you know, that have existed in artworks and sculptures for a really long time. So it's jaguar.
Yeah. And then this series, well, this I love this one. This is the story of like this. Is he a jaguar or is he a cougar?
P22. He's a mountain lion.
Yeah,
He lives in Griffith Park in LA, and they sort of have like kind of personifies this like idea of the urban wildlife of LA, because there's like coyotes everywhere and stuff like that. And so, you know, he's something that somehow he like ran across a freeway and now he's landlocked in this park. But he's sort of like a local hero. So I made a sculpture of him, honoring him. And another thing I was thinking about is taxidermy throughout all this. This is a picture of my father with a mountain lion.
Yeah. Okay, so then the shift to kind of like back to these sort of iconic figures, athletes. Do you want to talk about this Willie Mays story?
Remind me what story.
I was trying to remember too. Maybe you just, I don't know. Anyway, okay, we can skip over these, cruise through these guys. But these figurative bronzes, I think this is maybe like you're doing these figurative bronzes and like the figure, the athlete, the Hellenistic influences on the whole thing, and then you make this shift to do your Highway Hex show at CAM.
So I get this opportunity to do a show at the CAM, and which is kind of crazy to be like, it was my first museum show, and to have it be in Houston, where I was from originally, and sort of feel like I went all these places, and then this thing that I've always wanted to do is going to be back where I left from. And we talked about lots of ideas, what I wanted to do, and I really wanted to make a film as part of the project. And being in LA, where, you know, movies are made, I was really interested in props. And instead of kind of like collecting these props that had already existed, I started to think about the film as being like a vessel for sculpture, like the way that a show would be in a gallery or something. So I started building props out of what I had, the stuff that I had around my house, these things I had collected and like hoarded at my studio, and then employing them in the film. You know, this is.
And describe the premise of this film, because you sort of reverse engineered the whole thing, where you wanted to make the sculptures that went in the film. That was like kind of your priority. But then you also wanted to write a script. So you wrote the script to the film, which is called Sweet Perfume. And can you kind of lay out the narrative of that?
Yeah, I guess I had a lot of anxiety about like returning to Houston to do this show, and I started to think about like, well, let me like work that into the concept. Let me like, what kind of juice can I, all this crazy energy, and like what kind of juice can I get off of that to do something? And so I started thinking about like, if all, you know, all these people go to California and sort of reinvent themselves, and they do like new age stuff, and they change who they are, and I started thinking about like, what if there's this end part of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre where the sun is rising, and the people that Leatherface hasn't killed, they get away, and he just kind of starts dancing and like waving this chainsaw in the air. And I started thinking like, what if he just like started walking down the road, and then what if he kept going? What if he went all the way to California, and then what if he like changed his whole life?
Yeah, started over.
And then what if he had to go back?
Yeah.
And so then that's what I kind of wrote the movie about. I guess I felt like Leatherface, but Stephanie, my wife, played Leatherface in the movie.
This Leatherface, this Leatherface is made from garden gloves that you guys dissected and then stitched back to be this mask for her. Costume.
So then it was like same thing, kind of with playing in the bands and having no real like support. And it was like I know several artists who had made movies, and it was like they go get a bunch of money from someone, and they hire a film crew, and it turns into this big production that doesn't really have anything to do with them. And I really wanted it to just use everything I had, involve as few people as possible. So it's like we were filming, this is my studio, so we were like filming at my studio, Then we were filming it at my house. That's my bed at my house, using my own house.
And you're filming on just like a night, like a 90s camcorder kind of situation. So it's like really grainy. And
Yeah. It was
poor
the
resolution.
camcorder. It was the camcorder that my friend had that we would like film like, skateboarding tricks with, or like jokes or whatever. And it was something I was familiar with, so I found one, and that's what we used to film the movie. Mm-hmm. And then another thing was I wanted to like make the soundtrack. So we made the soundtrack, but we made the soundtrack like inside of the set. This is my friend Lucas, I think he's playing guitar. We're recording it onto a computer. We edited the film like on a laptop hooked up to a big screen TV I bought off of Craigslist. And the whole thing, one thing I was really thinking about was this photo. This is like one of my favorite artworks, I think, of all time. And this sort of kind of influenced the whole film.
Yeah.
You can kind of see how
Yeah.
the relationship. The other thing I was thinking about was this bar. I wanted to have this bar scene. And there's a group of Larry McMurtry essays in Narrow Grave, and he talks about Houston as just like essentially being like a city of bars, and everything happens inside bars. And this is a photo of a bar called Lola's in Houston that when I was in high school, I had a teacher who was kind of like, I don't know how to describe him. He was kind of bad. And he would tell us like stories about what happened outside of school. And one time he told us that he was like, yeah, this weekend, he would tell just me and my friend, he'd take us out in the hall and sit there and be like, oh man, I'm so hungover. And we'd be like, oh yeah, what happened? And he'd be like, well, this weekend I went to this bar called Lola's and this guy got his ear ripped off. And I think at that point I was just like, I'm going to Lola's.
Yeah,
As soon as I can, I'm going to Lola's. So this is a picture of Lola's. This is my studio. This is building the set. You can go take this.
Okay.
Building the set in the studio for the film. And then I took a lot of the props and parts of the set and rebuilt it as an installation inside of my show at the Cam. Mm-hmm. And the idea was like Houston also has these weird businesses where it's like two things in one. So part of the movie happens in a pawn shop and part of it happens in a bar. So then I thought like, what would be better than a pawn shop and a bar where you can sell your stuff and then buy alcohol with the money. Mm-hmm. And so the installation in the Cam was sort of based on that idea.
Yeah. And I saw this. This was the first time I'd ever seen your work, was at this show. And I drove with our mutual friend Randy Kennedy to get there and had this long day in the car. Stopped in Waxahachie to go to the web gallery, got the whole web gallery tour. That's like 3 hours. Then we get in the car and we drive all the way to Houston. By the time I got there, I had like total vertigo and was car sick. And then we go in the basement of the Cam and watch your movie, which made me so much more car sick. It was like, because the whole thing is like, there's no stability the whole time you're watching it. And it's, then they get in a car and they drive back to Texas, as you suggest, that Leatherface eventually has to return. And the reason he has to return is because he's gotten a letter from somebody back in Texas saying that essentially the land on which Texas Chainsaw Massacre takes place is being encroached upon by suburban
They're building a
development.
hotel.
Yeah.
It's like outside of Austin and they're building like a fancy hotel.
Yeah. And he's like, you better come back quick and you had Terry Allen.
Yeah, I wrote this monologue that was like, they're gonna have, guided meditation, a chili con queso fountain, medicinal cocaine, And it was this voice. It was a voicemail that he listens to on his answering machine, and yeah, I didn't know Terry at that point, and I bugged the shit out of him, and stalked him, and finally he recorded this thing. And I think we're friends now.
Yeah, sure. I think you are. Yeah. So then there's this this crazy, weird serendipity, I don't know, manifesting thing that happens where you've made this film about Leatherface returning to Texas and kind of facing his past, and just after this exhibition, you do exactly the same thing, and you make your way back, which wasn't something you planned, but something that sort of happened afterwards. Maybe you'd been thinking about all along, but here you are back in Texas, and there's this sort of, I don't know if there's been a shift in your work, but there's been a kind of like What happens next once you're here?
Well, I continued working on the sculptures, and I guess, I got kind of interested. I had explored the figure, and I started to think about, and maybe it was COVID, and maybe it's feeling like the world is ending or whatever. And I started to think about, what if I sort of remove the figure, and what if I turned it into almost like an installation of animals and animals and trees and plants, and kind of like this idea of like, maybe it's not that scary, the idea of us not being here.
Yeah.
Maybe like everything else would be better without
Humans
us
being
here.
gone. Yeah. We just, bye. Yeah. So then these sort of texts and icons fading away.
Yeah, in the midst of the cowboy dissolving. Civilization dissolving.
Yeah, McMurtry has that great line, which I always think about in relation to Sweet Perfume and your Leatherface character, that the cowboy has evolved into the suburbanite, and that he's just been absorbed into the city.
And kind of like the more that the figure of the cowboy recedes, the greater the myth becomes. Like the less of a reality it is, the more of a mythology.
Yeah, the greater the story. Yeah. Do you want to talk about these funny guys?
Yeah, there was this sculptor in Houston named David Addix, and there was sort of this unexplainable yard, an unlocked, like, kind of industrial yard full of these president heads. They were supposed to go somewhere, and they never did. And it became this place where you could go, like, in the middle of the night, and you can go inside of all of them.
But this idea of scale, like everything being scaled up, which is so related to the work that you're doing, where you're scaling up all of those toys into something that's monumental.
Yeah, I think that was part of the idea of those sculptures too. It was almost like I spent so much time as a kid playing around on a photocopier, like at my mom's office or where my dad worked, that I started to think about that kind of thing with the sculpture, like blowing small things up, taking big things, making them small.
Yeah.
Ideas and physical things.
Yeah.
So then I've been working on a show that's, this sort of like animal world. And thinking about like natural history museums and sort of creating these like diorama, life-size dioramas.
Yeah, where there's like, this is your vulture.
Yeah, like, and there's all this funny stuff that happens where it's like I was working on this vulture sculpture. I started it in LA. I didn't finish it. Brought it to Texas, but then when I moved to Texas, this vulture appeared on my deck when I was living in the hill country. That's the sculpture.
Yeah, so all these creatures that are going to occupy the gallery space at Karma in New York in January for the show, where you've removed, you've worked for years making these figures, and now you've taken them all away, so that when people enter the gallery, they're with this. Well, there's these boys, your dogs, but they'll be with just the animal kingdom basically, and the kind of props of nature and such. But without any, they'll be like the bodies of the guests, the viewers of the work will be.
Yeah, almost like the viewer becomes the figure.
Yeah, right. And it's like this idea that everything would be better without us, but we still have to enter to see it. The plants, and then this is the last one. Do you want to say anything about these guys?
What can you say about George Jones and Andy Warhol standing next to each other? I guess I want to say thank you.
Well, let's take some questions.
Thanks you guys for coming.
Yeah, so good. Does anybody have any questions? I can't see anything, but we will in a second. Any questions for Will? Yeah. There's a mic here. Anna has one at the side, but.
No, I see kind of one of the first pieces that you showed, the Widowmaker. I don't know, I just see a continuous kind of questioning throughout, the narrative is a questioning through all the work. And essentially, when I saw Widowmaker and the way you were explaining it, it was kind of like the death of your own childhood, that all of a sudden this child is, wanting to be a cowboy, wanting to get into this culture, wanting to create it or be a part of it. And obviously, the piece shows I would say the rough edges of becoming part of that culture. But at the same time, like, I listened to this questioning, is that the right path? But again, with everything, because you see it with all your different figures where you're detaching faces, you're adding new faces, and then all of a sudden I saw, you started making references to Roman sculptures. And Roman sculptures, like, they were also designed to be, for the heads to be taken apart because they were a symbol of democracy. They knew that, every certain amount of years there was going to be a new senator or a new, emperor, et cetera, et cetera. So in some kind of sense, I don't see you as a Texan artist. I see you as American artist because the work shows the freedom of deculturizing yourself, okay? And then, and again, that is a symbol of freedom, So it's very American, I think. So.
Well, that's interesting. Yeah, I don't know that anybody wants to be like, have the adjective in front of artist. It's like I love being from Texas and a Texan, but I think you're right. And I also think that, like, Texas is kind of to America what America is to the rest of the world.
Yeah. But again, think about human beings, any kind of culture. This could be translated to any kind of culture.
Yeah.
Let's say I'm Peruvian
Yeah.
or I'm from Brazil and I wanted to be a part of something. But the ability of, like, saying, when you get to a certain level of reflexivity, you say, no, maybe if I wouldn't have admired this kind of culture, I could have been something else. And, in a certain sense, your work does that. So, yeah.
Thanks.
Anyone else up here, Anna?
Hi. First of all, thank you very much for that biography. It's not easy to sit up on stage and talk about your life like that, so I appreciate that. When I was in New York, I was a familiar of Katie Noland.
Oh, cool.
And I just wanted to say that the work that you showed is called Oswald.
Oswald. Yeah.
And it was also, actually, it was co-made with Robert Nickus.
Yeah, Bob.
Yeah, who often doesn't get a look in there. But what I wanted to say about the overall arc of your work as you've shown it, it made me think about middle school being raised to an unbearably high level. and something like, as the person before me mentioned, how you deal with the fact that you are of a culture and that you use those resources in various ways. And I guess in your work, there's a lot of emphasis on both the stereotype and something below the stereotype or outside of the stereotype that you take for as the real or something that you've experienced that rubs against the stereotype. But somehow I'm thinking that this whole thing wrapped up, say, in the image of the cowboy has something to do with the loss of adolescence and the impossibility of both escaping it and then, how you operate as an artist in the world using those images, which in a way are the things that become part of us most strongly when we're seeking out our own identity as a person, i.e. during our adolescence.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I don't want to ask a question that's going to stop conversation. You must say something else, please.
What is the question? I think I missed the question part.
It's funny. I was one of the.
I like what you're saying,
Yeah.
but I don't.
One of something I was reading recently. Maybe it's in one of the things that you sent. I can't remember. Maybe it's in the Tompkins book. But Roy Lichtenstein said something about like, we're not promoting international teenagerism, but we also sort of are, kind of thing. Like this endless revolt against your identity at the same time you're using that stuff to make your own, as Michael's saying, your own identity and path. But yeah, it does. I mean, we were just talking about you returning to Houston and how like all your friends are gone, and it's like you going back to this place that you may not have as many close relationships anymore, but you've like gone back to like, yeah, but you're there. your identity is there. All the stuff of it. Yeah, it's all good. I like that you're not making people ask questions, they're just saying things.
I wonder what have you noticed in the rest of the world that they always put Texan instead of American? Like it's Texan with
Right, yeah.
They'll say American.
Yeah, no, there's a lot of
That's true.
There's a lot of funny stuff like that.
Yeah.
I think it's in Norway, like Texas means crazy. Like they'll say, oh, that's Texas. That's Texas. It means like that's totally fucked up or whatever.
In England it means that now too.
Oh, yeah?
Texan in front of your name or something.
Right.
Yeah.
That's true.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I just think it's interesting, having grown up here and grown up reading. I think it's interesting, having grown up here and having grown up reading Larry McMurtry. It's interesting, just the parallels that you have used in your work of him. And he sort of is what many people identify Texas as being like. Bigger than life, larger than life. I don't think that's a question, but anyway.
Yeah.
No, that's interesting. It was something I was really like not interested in, honestly, until I started last year or so researching and reading more of his writing. I think I always thought about, like the Lonesome Dove TV
Like
show.
romantic.
Like my parents watching that
Yeah.
show and just being like, oh. The guy's rubber nose, Blue Duck's nose prosthetic.
God. Yeah. Yeah. But McMurtry.
It's incredibly relevant.
It is, yeah. And he similarly like didn't just like love it all. Like he fought against it pretty hard too. And
Yeah, I mean, I think as an artist, your job is to question who you are, where you're from, where you're going.
Yeah.
And it's interesting when that lines up with other things.
Yeah.
Because no one is, it's crazy to be like, if I was sitting in Chicago right now, I could be saying whatever the hell I wanted to say about Texas, and everybody's saying, okay, you know what I mean? So it's kind of interesting to be sitting in Dallas and talking to presumably a room full of mostly Texans, except for that guy. But,
Yeah. Anyone else? Thank you all. Oh, we have one.
So this Mark Flood experience in your early life is so fascinating to me. I wonder where you think you would be without that, and if you have a notion to mentor someone like that. It's it was you who made the choice to be that person with him, but so fascinating to me.
yeah, no, it is one of those big questions. Like one of those people who, what would life be like if that thing hadn't happened,
Yeah.
Either be like, I don't know, a businessman, or in jail, I guess. Who knows? Or both. Yeah.
Permissible ice cream place you worked at.
Yeah. I'd be making ice cream.
Yeah. Thank you all for coming.
Thanks so much.